Today is all about vintage decor. How do you add it into your home? How do you get the look? What is it? We're going into it. All right, guys, I'm super excited. Let's dive into vintage design style. So a lot of times what will happen is people will use vintage and antique interchangeably. The thing is, they're not actually the same thing. What's really interesting is that vintage items can definitely be antiques. However, antiques are very specific in that antique items are actually over 100 years old. So sometimes we'll have vintage items that are not antiques. So there's sometimes the interchangeable use with these two terms, but they're not always the same thing. So think of something from like the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Those would all be considered vintage items, but they would not be considered antique items, at least not yet. Sometimes things that are recreated to look like a vintage piece, but actually aren't a vintage piece. So I always think of those things that are made to look like appliances from the 50s. So they're made to look old, they're made to look like a vintage item, but they actually are not a vintage item. So there is a distinction there where vintage is still from an era, specifically from that time period that we're, now repurposing and using in, today's time. But there are other items that are made to look like vintage items but aren't. So there is also that clarification there with vintage versus antique versus repurposed versus made to look old. So why are people all over vintage right now? Vintage adds a lot of personality to a home. And I think that's what we're really seeing in a lot of design styles. And what I love about vintage is that you can repurpose it into many different design styles. It doesn't have to be a specific look, but if you want to incorporate those vintage pieces, it definitely helps add more of a personality, more of a vibe. There's usually a story to go with those pieces, whether it's inherited or something that you have found antique shopping or at a market or heck, even on a Facebook Marketplace or something. You never know where you might find a great vintage piece. And when we're talking about designing your space, a really big thing about any space and any style, whether you're a minimalist or a maximalist, is infusing your personal style into it, infusing your authenticity into the space. It's really important to find a way to curate your space to really represent you and your family and what you gravitate towards. Now, you don't have to do that, of course, but I think it makes a home feel a lot more homey and a lot more cozy and a place that you're really proud of when you start infusing some of those personalized touches that really make it uniquely yours or your family's. So how can you bring in some vintage to your home? Some items that I know I have come across, especially because I personally really love going to antique stores. So you definitely find a lot of vintage items versus antiques. I find at most, at least the ones I've been to, antique stores. There's a wide range of items, right? And one of those items is mirrors. Mirrors are great to bring into a space because there's such a wide variety of styles and cuts and shapes and whether you like something more ornate and Victorian looking or something more Art Deco looking or something totally outside of the box. I mean, really, it's up to you. But there's a lot of really cool vintage mirrors that I see when I've, been searching for interesting items. Also, hardware. I always run into hardware. I love hardware because you can update something as simple as a generic or timeless dresser with some really interesting vintage hardware to completely change the feel of that particular piece. Also, your door hardware, your cabinetry hardware, pretty much anywhere that you have a handle or a pull, you can really update that to look totally different just by adding in different hardware. So artwork is another great way to bring in vintage items. Something that I've personally done is I've actually gone to my local antique shop. I found really cool frames. The artwork, I haven't really run into great artwork personally. Doesn't mean it's not out there. But those frames were really, really cool. They had a really interesting vibe. They had that old world, really, ornate look to them. That being said, I didn't love, they were all in gold and I didn't like the look of them at the time. So then I had sprayed them white. And then now just recently I've resprayed them again. They are gold, but they're more like a champagne gold to keep on current trends. And that's something that I really like to do to bring in some vintage items It has a story. I've repurposed it, and I actually took all the artwork out, but I mean, you could keep the artwork in, you could reframe some artwork. There's a whole bunch of ways that you could look at vintage artwork to bring into your space. Furniture. I feel like we have seen a lot about furniture. I always think of like dressers, sideboards, cabinets. We see a lot of repurposing of that stuff. It's great from like a sustainability aspect, of course, because we're repurposing existing furniture, but from a vintage find, you can find some really cool pieces. And let's say, I know some people blast me on this, but let's say you love a piece, but it's like ugly color, which I've done that to my dresser. It was this hideous red, cherry red, like deep cherry. I don't know. Ugh, it was terrible. But I repainted it. It looks gorgeous. I kept the original hardware because it was really, really beautiful. And I completely repurposed it wasn't an antique. It was just old and it was beautiful and it had a serpentine front. But, I understand not wanting to like repurpose like an antique piece. It does have a lot of value. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about an older piece that, it needs a little love. Those pieces are great to refinish. So just a brief pause here. If you're enjoying the content of today's video, please consider hitting that thumbs up button. I really do appreciate it. It helps the algorithm, all that jazz. So thank you very much. So I was working on this one project where we had these amazing chairs from the 70s. And this is actually like a reverse, like I didn't paint them, I actually stripped them. They had been painted in this terrible brown and the fabric was all worn, the seats were all worn. So we ended up stripping all the paint off and discovered that it was gorgeous walnut. It was absolutely stunning. And then we just put a natural protective stain on it, like completely clear, just to protect the wood because now it was exposed. And they just became the most stunning pieces of furniture ever. And then we had the cushions reupholstered, restuffed, the whole 9 yards. And we basically brought these old dilapidated chairs from the 70s back to life. And they're super on trend right now, which is crazy. But those were vintage pieces that we actually completely refreshed for this design project. And I'm telling you, what a win. We had no idea what that paint was covering up. So sometimes the other way, not painting something, but actually removing all of the ugly paint and having it refinished is also another really great way to embrace vintage furniture. So one of the things with vintage furniture that you do want to focus on when you're searching for vintage finds is trying to find a good quality piece and something that's well made and still has a lot of life left in it, even if it might not be aesthetically where it needs to be and you have to refinish it a little bit or do some updates. That is a really, important thing I find with furniture, because you don't want it to look cheap and you also don't want it to fall apart if you do have to do some refinishing to it. So definitely, trying to find a good quality piece, whether you're refinishing it, keeping the same, or stripping it, maybe it's been refinished too many times, whatever the case may be, definitely trying to find something that's well built and well constructed. So how do you know if it's a good quality item? A few little side tips here for you. So the weight of an item will really help with that. If it's pretty hefty, pretty, weighty, it's probably made of solid natural materials rather than something like a particle board, because that's quite a bit lighter and, they can cover it with a veneer. So sometimes it can look like real wood, but if it's not really heavy, it's probably not a solid wood piece, or it's not made from a lot of natural materials. So that's a really good tell when you're looking for a good quality piece. Another little tidbit is to look at how the joints are put together. A lot of times with dressers specifically, in more of the higher end, the better quality pieces, you will see like a dovetail joint. I'll show you what that looks like. It's the way that they put it together really does matter. It's just not like cheaply glued, screwed, nailed together. It's actually like really well constructed. So there's a few things that you'll see with some of these items, or you can look for with some items, that will really help you tell if it's a well constructed piece. And another thing, if you're buying something with metals, like I have a vintage wine rack thing, and I will tell you right now that thing is rusting real bad. So looking for rust is really important, because obviously if it's rusting, it could just kind of basically disintegrate. So if it is rusting, you could probably fix it, especially if it's surface rust. If it's like really like starting to put holes in it, that's a whole different story. It's probably going to take a lot more to, bring that back to life if possible. Maybe you could have it welded or something. I don't even know. But definitely looking out for rust spots. surface versus like more actually eating away at the solid material. Rust on the surface you can easily clean up and, make it look beautiful again. Another great item that you can bring into your home is vintage light fixtures. I find there's always like really cool chandeliers when I go to Southworks Antiques. It's the antique shop that I tend to go to quite often. And they're not always the best looking, but I always think if I, tweak it a little bit, maybe spray it, you could totally update that vintage lighting. And so sometimes they're just great the way they are. Like there's this whole Art Deco movement and like a lot more of those traditional vibes. So definitely like think about some of those pieces. Maybe you can bring it in. It adds a story. And lighting is always really important in every space. I always find when you have great lighting, especially a great lighting fixture, people ask about it or they want to talk about it because it is such a focal point of the space. So bringing in interesting little decor items throughout your home that are vintage is also a great way to bring in that vintage style and that personality. So let's say you're really interested in pottery, finding some really cool vintage pottery items and bringing that in can really add some interesting discussion points to a space, put it on display. Another one is vintage books, vintage cookbooks, specifically for the kitchen. I really like books. I don't know what could possibly give it away. And vintage books is really cool to have on display. Like if you could get some of the like classic books like Jane Austen, those kind of things in like a vintage leather bound. Oh my gosh. I mean, it just looks stunning. And it is something that, speaks to your personality if you're somebody like me, particularly and love books. But let's say you're into cameras. So vintage cameras, that's something else that you could bring in. I don't have any, but I really, really like vintage typewriters, like those, really old school, just looks really cool. I think they're really neat. I don't have any, but I've always liked them. And every time I see one, I'm like, I should get one, but I don't know where to put it. So I never end up getting one. But that being said, items like that, if you curate it properly so it's not just like too much stuff, because that's one thing. I mean, it depends on how much like maximalism or minimalism or wherever you land in between that you want to go with some of these items. So definitely like curating the look, trying to create a story that works for you is a big part of that as well. And just a little tidbit, sometimes just going to like a Value Village or some type of like thrift shop, you can actually find really interesting vintage, art pieces or decor pieces. Sometimes, not always, it can be a hit or miss, but that's always a good place to check as well. And it's usually like super inexpensive. Also going to garage sales. Oftentimes you'll find really interesting pieces. I know like my husband loves garage sales and he always finds like amazing stuff there. So he's more of a tool guy, but I'm sure there are like lots of different things that you end up finding at garage sales that could be vintage, especially if it's like an estate sale where it's like somebody who's lived there for a long time and they need to, sell off their stuff or they've passed away, unfortunately. And now it's like, but you can find some really great gems in those estate sales. So another way to, find some really cool vintage items. So when you're trying to create that vintage vibe, there is some architectural details that you could add to your existing home, even if it's a new build, that will definitely help give it a lot more character. Some of those items include wood beams on the ceiling. Now, they don't have to be real wood beams. They can be like faux wood beams that look real, so they're a lot easier to install. They look really interesting because they take something that's pretty simple and plain and actually give it a real big statement. I personally love beams on a ceiling. So something else you can do to add a really interesting architectural details is installing crown moldings or baseboards. A lot of new build homes come with like a 4-inch baseboard, just kind of like your bare minimum. But if you up that to, like a 7-inch or a 10-inch or a 12-inch, you can really change the whole vibe of the home. And baseboards don't have to be super traditional. I feel like a lot of times you think of those like Victorian, like really detailed baseboards, but I know in a lot of the homes that I've been working on recently, we've done a lot of more modern style baseboards, very simple, very clean, but we've definitely brought up that height to like around 11 inches. It's really, really nice way to up level the look of a home, if you're able to, of course. Again, we mentioned hardware, so the door hardware can be changed very easily to help give a home, even a newer built home, more of a vintage vibe. Another one that I personally love is wall paneling. So whether it's wainscoting or beadboard or shiplap, there's lots of different ways to add wood paneling to your walls. All depends on the look you're going for. That can really, really change the look and feel of any space, no matter when it was built or constructed. We mentioned lighting, so replacing your generic light fixtures with a more interesting and unique vintage light fixture that you find, or something that looks vintage. It doesn't, like, if you just want the look and you don't want the authenticity around vintage, just something that looks vintage, you could totally do that too. So depending on the home that you have, also upgrading your doors, so having more panel door versus just like a builder grade door is another way to really, add that vintage charm to your space. What I think is really interesting about vintage style is that it's not one way or another. It's not one specific look that will make your home have that vintage feel. It's really about embracing, say you like French country or you like mid-century modern, that you gravitate towards, and maybe embracing certain vintage pieces, no matter what style you're into your space to help create some more personality, some more, interesting discussion pieces, and really help curate the look to tailor to whatever you are into. And I think that's really what is awesome about vintage, and I think why we're seeing a lot of people embrace the vintage style, because it is about that storytelling. And you can have vintage even if you're really into minimalist and more modernism, because a great Eames chair, which is a vintage piece if you have like a real deal one, or even like a remake because they remade them back in the day, which would still be considered vintage. They add a statement, right? So you could have just that one piece and be a minimalist, or you could be somebody who's more of a maximalist and can have like a bunch of, vintage books on display, or a pottery collection, or whatever it is that you're gravitating towards, and anywhere in between, which is why I really like infusing vintage items into your decor. And I know for myself, I do have a lot of vintage items. I have some antique items, and I find that those are my most prized possessions, and I always try to figure out a way, no matter where I'm living, to incorporate them into the design, because they just mean so much to me that it is very important that I work them in somehow. So that's another great thing with vintage finds, is you will probably keep them no matter what style you have and try to rework them in. So if you guys enjoyed today's video, don't forget to hit that thumbs up button. I greatly appreciate it. And don't forget to subscribe. I sometimes forget to ask you that. So definitely subscribe. And until next time, bye.